Hello, welcome to our presentation, Open for Whom? Challenging Information Privilege in Social Work. I'm Kimberly Pendell, Social Work and Social Sciences Librarian at Portland State University. My co-presenter is Matthew DeCarlo, Assistant Professor of Social Work at Stockton University. And we have a project called Open Social Work, and you can find us at opensocialwork.org and on Twitter at OpenSWResearch.
Hey everyone, so our agenda for this session, Kimberly is going to go over information privilege and go over sort of the status quo of scholarly communications and how we access and share information. We'll then review some of the aims of open practice and how it aims to achieve social justice, and then critique how well openness does at achieving those ends and some of the threats that it faces. We'll then reconsider how to understand open using the ethics of care, and then talk finally about how open can inform the grand challenges of social work.
We'll start with the idea of information privilege. Information privilege is defined as the advantages, opportunities, rights, and affordances granted by status and positionality to information and knowledge building. Information privilege or lack thereof impacts individuals and communities locally and internationally. For example, social workers are cut off from the very research that we hope they will utilize to inform their practice. Community members who are participants in and stakeholders of research cannot access and use that same research for their own needs. Developing nations cannot afford journal subscriptions, software licenses, or commercial textbooks, inhibiting them from using the corpus of existing Western knowledge to the benefit of oppressed and marginalized groups. A vicious cycle, these barriers also reify the role of Western nations as the producers of knowledge and objective scientific truth, while scholars in the rest of the world are positioned as passive recipients of Western knowledge, not as producers of knowledge themselves. Information privilege recognizes the inequitable power structures in our information production, dissemination, and use practices. The majority of scholarship is owned by a handful of commercial publishers, scholarly societies, and other private companies. This is especially true in the social sciences. These information monopolies are products of antiquated scholarly practices and an obsession with prestige. We have a current situation where 3 textbook publishers control 80% of the market and 5 journal publishers control 50% of the market. And that goes up to 70% when you're talking about social sciences journals. These monopolies are contradictory to our contemporary ability to produce, review, and share information. It's hard to reconcile the dramatic barriers to access, reliance on unpaid academic labor, and the demand for copyright transfer on one hand, with the 40% profit margins of Elsevier and the over 1,000% hike in textbook costs over the past 50 years on the other hand. This tweet summarizes the strange reality of scholarly publishing. We provide free content and labor to publishers, we sign away our rights to that content, and then we pay them for it. So what is open science? Open science calls attention to the practices and policies surrounding the creation and transmission of knowledge. This includes the research process itself, the review of the research, and the availability of the research. The hard sciences shift to preprint sharing preceded the larger open access movement. Their goal was to share data and research faster, which meant bypassing the much slower traditional publishing process. Researchers started noticing additional benefits to open practices, improving research reproducibility, being able to reuse another study's data or adapt a textbook. So there is an efficiency appeal to open science. Open practices are also very much tied to social justice ideals, as well as the improvements to the research process. Ideally, open practices would create a scholarly communication structure that encourages openness of the research process with all stakeholders, creates space for the knowledge and expertise of marginalized communities, makes access to knowledge free for all, and extends the benefits of scholarship to everyone. John Walensky, a leader of the open access movement, said it this way, quote, Access to knowledge is a human right that is closely associated with the ability to defend as well as to advocate for other rights, end quote. It was these ideas of universal human rights that grounded the Budapest Open Access Initiative, the Open University, the Free Software Foundation, and many other organizations. However, these ideals do not automatically transform into something equitable. The structures of scholarly communication, even with open access and open educational resources, still replicate the existing problem of prioritizing certain types of knowledge and making the production and dissemination of that knowledge subject to capitalist forces. For example, as soon as open access and open educational resources began eating into the profits of large publishing companies, those companies decided that they too were supporters of open. Unfortunately, this has meant integrating or absorbing OA and OER efforts into their corporate structures and figuring out ways to monetize it. Open washing is a term to describe how corporate interests have co-opted the ideals of open practices. Publishers are repackaging open content and then selling it. In the realm of textbooks, education reporter Doug Lederman said, quote, publishers are essentially ceding the high cost of development of texts to the community at large, much of it in the not-for-profit sector, and focusing on the lower cost and higher margin business of selling materials around the core text. Some academic publishers have moved into the realm of data brokering and use OA and OER as a means of sweeping up data, whether it be user data or citation data, to mine and sell for profit. In regard to journal publishing, article processing charges are a good example of an open access publishing funding model that started out innocently enough. APCs were a way of both supporting the production and maintenance of a journal while also replacing the paywall subscription with freely accessible content. However, the growing acceptance of the model gave publishers a motivation to exploit it. Obviously, this complicates our view of open, and we must continually push to keep open practices as an anti-capitalist and decolonizing social justice effort. A very recent example of publishers cashing in on the new open access requirement for research in the European Union is Springer Nature journals charging German universities the equivalent of $11,733 US to publish a single article in one of their high prestige journals. Matt will now discuss openness reimagined in the context of care and as a participatory and critical practice.
Thank you, Kimberly. I think that that is a fantastic example of how scholarly publication has really become divorced from the needs of the community and has really created these intellectual monopolies that benefit the few and the information privileged over the broader society. And I think as Open has looked at other frameworks for approaching social justice work, so not just these sort of like universalistic notions of autonomy, rationality, and rights, but looking at pedagogies of care and care relationships, and centering ideas like relationality, compassion, partial perspectives, and interdependence. What does scholarly publication look like from that perspective? From an ethics of care perspective, the first thing that we have to do is to attend to student concerns. And what students are telling us about the impact of textbook costs should cause us a great deal of concern. So these quotes are from a study that I did of social work students in Virginia. There are about 156 students that responded to our survey. And I think that this quote illustrates well some of the concerns that students have about textbook costs. And what we find is that students are taking on more work, they're taking on more loans. About a quarter of our students are skipping meals to pay for textbooks. Most of our students don't purchase the textbook within the first few weeks of class because they want to make sure that that $100 purchase is actually needed in order to be successful in the class. You know, some faculty don't actually use the textbooks that they require. Some faculty restate the entire textbook during class in PowerPoint format. And what we see, especially with our BSW students, is piracy. So taking pictures of your neighbor's textbook, making a copy of them, or going to pirate repositories and downloading an illegal PDF of that textbook. So how does our reliance on these closed content platforms, so these textbooks and other closed platforms, inhibit our ability to respond to students' needs like this? And the reason why it is difficult for us to respond to student needs and to provide more caring alternatives is because our scholarly publication system has capital at the center and this idea of individualistic ownership of knowledge. Yet we know that knowledge itself is a public good. It is in fact a pure public good. One person's use of a learning object or an idea inside of their course does not take away from anybody else's use of it. It is non-rivalrous, it is endlessly renewable, and it is abundant inside of the social world. And yet this does not match the way in which we have decided as a discipline to share our knowledge. Instead, we have decided to build it around market value price, competition, around hierarchy, and the accumulation and enclosure of knowledge and capital and resources. So it is worth thinking about, from an ethics of care perspective, what would it look like if life were at the center? If values related to the interdependence of human life, solidarity, democratic and open knowledge, transparency in how that knowledge is produced, the values-based perspective to redistribute knowledge and to not wall off access to knowledge, and redistribute the values and roles for creating that knowledge, and make sure that everyone can equitably participate in the scholarly conversation so that they can use information to make social change or individual change that is meaningful to them. And that by embracing these alternative publication structures, we can center care. And we can attend and respond to the student needs that are presented to us. So all of that sounds great. We can create these new systems and all of them are going to work. They're going to be free to everybody. Everybody can equitably participate. If it sounds very pie in the sky, I understand that. And so what open has gotten to is that when the rubber hits the road, these sort of universalistic and idealistic notions about what publication can be and should be must deal with the system that currently exists and the current cultural and historical conditions and economic conditions that we have as part of scholarly communication, as well as the broader culture and society in which that publication takes place. So when the rubber hits the road, open cannot remain values neutral. It has to have something to strive toward. So what should we use open to do? What goal are we striving towards, and how can open be a tool for getting to that place? So one of the things that open has started to embrace, and you see this a lot at Open Education and Open Access Conference, is care. And care is a tool for social transformation and social change. That when it is rooted in the actual practices and mechanisms that guarantee its redistribution towards lasting social reorganization, care can be a tool for radical change. And inside of the classroom, what open pedagogy is about building caring and connection for digital learning. It's about producing within the virtual space or within the face-to-face environment as well, these replicable mechanisms of collective care. So that if a faculty member provides something that provides for the needs of students or has a way of communicating a concept or supporting students that is a best practice or at least emerging and useful practice, that they can share that with other faculty members. That they can develop tools for a more diverse, inclusive, and truly participatory social environment and relationships. And that faculty members have to embrace a notion of radical flexibility. As people are engaging in education in an authentic way, it requires a much more flexible approach towards learning. Some of the benefits that come from open pedagogy include things like fighting surveillance and monetization of student data, as well as fighting walled gardens and intellectual monopolies that foreclose our ability to transformatively use social work knowledge in order to educate students and produce social change. Instead, it invites collaboration in communities of practice, By using open licenses, people can grant permission for transformative use of any intellectual property that they own or have created. This creates a sustainable future because people can access that information for free and can build on it and adapt it to their individual learning context and share that back out to the community. And that is what open pedagogy strives towards. It's not only about bringing caring relationships to your students, but also caring for each other. I think one of the things that motivates me most personally at this point is COVID-19 and just how overwhelmed and stressed faculty members are with trying to create authentic, meaningful online learning experiences, and how disconnected we are from each other in that fight. Because we build on closed platforms, because the content that we are building from is not open, we cannot share the products that we create, or our practices simply don't align with that being a goal. And what that means is faculty burnout, overwork, because we have to reinvent the wheel at every single campus teaching the same course. As we talked about, the purpose of open science and open education and open access is up for debate. Obviously, we want to make everybody be able to participate in research. We want research to be easier to do. We want access to research data. But for what? Why are we trying to do this? This is where international development goals, so the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the grand challenges of social work come in. So when we're thinking about how are we doing at achieving some of these grand challenges, when we study and we create interventions and study those interventions as to how well you're doing on that goal, are we ensuring that that information is free for people to access? That people can build on that information in meaningful ways, that our communities are empowered to transform and engage with that knowledge, that knowledge creation itself is not reproducing oppression and privilege, and that our scholarly practices do not serve capital, but rather serve the communities from which that research emerges. And one of the best ways to frame what this looks like is this graphic over here. So this was created by the open and collaborative science community. And at the middle of this diagram is the regular old research cycle. So gathering data, analyzing data, that sort of stuff. So what supports that process? What supports the equitable right to participate in research? And that would be those open science practices, sharing your data openly, publishing in open access journals, or using green open access to make your scholarly products available to everybody, using open hardware and open code so people can replicate what you do, providing open peer review so people can see how your resource has changed over time. And more importantly, why are we doing all of this? What are these sort of principles behind it? From the open science community, we have the idea of a knowledge commons. A knowledge commons means all individuals have the means to decide how knowledge is governed and managed to address their needs. That when intellectual and cultural resources are collectively managed, shared, and used and governed by all or most members of the community, that social equity is served. Additionally, cognitive justice, the need for diverse understandings and knowledge to coexist within scientific productions, rather than replicating traditional knowledge structures which export Western ideas to other communities. Similarly, situated openness addresses the ways in which context and power and inequality condition scientific research, and the understanding that knowledge is situated within historical, political, and social cultural relationships, and that there are inequities and hierarchies in knowledge production that need to be actively fought against. Because everybody does have a right to research, and that enables different forms of participation in democracy at all stages of the research process. And it's also about the right of people's ability to take the knowledge that they gained to help their communities and fulfill their own capabilities. That open and collaborative science is about fostering equitable participation between scientists and social actors, and that cultivates co-creation of social innovation in society. and that by creating inclusive infrastructures, we can empower people of all abilities to make and use accessible open source technologies and tools that integrate diverse contexts and needs of all stakeholders in their design. And using these as a pathway for sustainable development, equipping every individual to improve their well-being of our society and of our planet. So I ask, as we are thinking about the grand challenges of social work, when we're thinking about the things we want to accomplish, how are we making those practices available to everybody? How are we making sure that people have the ability to not only access the products of research, to meaningfully participate in the research process through participatory design, but the right to replicate that research and then to use it in transformative ways for themselves and for their communities?
Thank you for listening to our presentation. Please feel free to email Matthew and I with any questions you might have. You can learn more about open access and open educational resources in social work on our website, and you can follow us on Twitter.